I put the title here for this little presentation as Inclusive Policy Processes, something like a Sceptical View, or something like that. And I said yesterday that my job was to try and provoke you into disagreeing with me about things as a way of getting thinking. So I would like to just explain where I'm coming from in this. About 10 years ago, I wrote a journal paper which is still quite widely cited, which makes the case for inclusive policy processes, amongst other things. It's only one section of the paper, but it's a fairly straight argument that we need more inclusive policy processes. So it's not that I think that these are rubbish, but I have become a little bit more sceptical over time in terms of how effectively they work, and perhaps more importantly about how easy it's going to be to make them to work better in the short term. So that my skepticism is not so much about the principle, but just about how easy it's going to be to sort out some of the practical difficulties with them. And that's what I'm going to talk about here briefly. So, I understand, just to make sure we're all on the same page at the start, participatory policy processes. I'm talking here primarily about participation by representatives of civil society organisations and/or the commercial private sector in a whole range of processes of policy development. I've listed some there. This happened early on. One of the first places that really got this going was in PRSPs, where there was often a requirement that there was participation of these other actors in the development of the PRSP strategy. We now have it often in the development of agricultural sector strategy documents. The CADP process, which we'll talk about later, required participation of these other actors in the round table and the business meeting. We can find examples in Kenya over the past decade of bringing non-state actors into ASCU working groups that were looking at how do we move forward in particular areas of policy. In Rwanda, we heard about the agricultural sector working group, where non-state actors also participate in that group. I'm not sure quite where this has got to, but I know that in USAID thinking, at least, joint sector reviews incorporate non-state actors in the review panel. You could also mention in value chain analysis and how do we move forward in particular value chains. There, actually, I think there's quite a lot of good examples of getting the multiple stakeholders in value chains together and talking about where are the particular problems, what can we do about it. That, I think, is quite, there's an area where there's some success. And participatory planning, I believe, is actually enshrined in the Ghana Constitution, and the National Development Planning Commission has over the years tried to develop guidelines for how this is done. So all policy in Ghana is supposed to have this multi-stakeholder planning element in it. Okay, and I'll come back to that because that's a very interesting example where the government of Ghana decided that back in 1992. There is quite a lot of domestic ownership of that agenda. The practice may be a little bit different, but there is quite a bit of domestic ownership on it. And that's a really key point I'll come back to. Just finishing off from where Steve was, there are plenty of challenges just coordinating across multiple state agencies, let alone bringing in non-state actors. Okay? But I'm going to talk primarily about this element here. Okay, why do we do this? These arguments really are sort of putting in a slightly different spin on our basic arguments about participation in any form of development. These actors bring additional insights, sources of information, viewpoints for policy making. I think probably the most persuasive case here is if you're looking to create a decent business environment and what's a policy that will create the right rules of the game that you want for the private sector, but if it's going to work, you really need some engagement with the private sector who understand these things far better than most state actors do. And if you just sit in your office in government and try and devise a policy, the chances are it'll backfire terribly. Yeah? So you really want to talk with the people who have expertise in these things in order to deliver a policy or to design a policy that's going to do what you want. I would say here therefore there's quite a lot of asymmetric information, particularly with commercial actors, what's considered commercially sensitive, and that's only going to be divulged where there's quite a degree of trust, and that's something that often doesn't exist at the moment, which means that participation doesn't necessarily get to the sort of objectives you want to achieve. Ideally, if there's a sense of ownership that goes beyond just state actors, that might assist implementation, particularly where they're expected to have a key part in pursuing the policy. And then there's the question of, if you bring in other actors into the policy processes, particularly if it's not just the planning stage, but also in the review stage, which is what's current, there's a push for that at the moment, are you going to get some slightly greater accountability of state actors to non-state actors for the performance of their roles? And should that be mutual, I guess, is another question. But as soon as you start talking in that language, you get to this question, which is, particularly at high level, do the state actors actually want this? Is there demand for what non-state actors can bring to the policy process? And that, to me, is one of the really key questions in this. So I come back to Ghana. There's some ownership of, there are benefits from this, and we will pursue this. Okay? That's not really strong demand, but there's some evidence, there's a recognition enshrined in the Constitution and tried to be worked out through the Planning Commission guidelines that this is beneficial. Again, is because they are so focused on outcomes and getting the outcomes right, that anybody who will make a constructive contribution to improving the design of policy so that outcomes are better, they are welcomed. Anyone who's going to stand at the sidelines and criticize is completely shut out. But if you're going to be constructively contributing useful information and ideas to the formulation of better policy, you are welcomed. There's an understanding right from the top that this is beneficial. But I don't see this in all countries. I talked yesterday about how those with power hold all the cards. And in this case, it's a question, effectively, of state actors opening up their planning and other processes to non-state actors. Now, why do they want to do that, particularly if it's going to lead to greater accountability? Remember, we all think that's a good thing, but if you actually like to keep some things in the dark, that's not a good thing. I talked yesterday, this is not true in every country, but if you see your ministry, you're rewarding members of your government coalition for their support in winning the presidential election, you're giving them a ministry so they can reward their supporters, actually, you don't want too many people getting too close to the information on what's going on. I had an interesting experience 20-odd years ago when I worked as a civil servant in the Commission for Lands and Environment in Zanzibar, and one of the big things we were doing at that time was handling lots of applications for hotel investments all around the coast of Zanzibar. And at one point, we started a process of going to some of the communities where we knew there was the most interest from investors for land, and where we knew there were clashes with the existing uses of that coastline and of the intertidal zone and of a coastal fringe, with fishing and seaweed farming and all sorts of other things that were going on there, livelihood activities of the population. And we gathered together the various village leaders and other people in the villages, and we sat down and we did participatory mapping of their areas and what the uses of these different bits of land were in their areas. And what would be the impacts of tourism investment, which they were reasonably aware of, and therefore if we were going to allow land allocations in their area, which would be the key bits to avoid to minimize conflict with the local communities, and which would be the best areas where we could say yes, land could be allocated to investors there, because they could see the benefits of jobs and other things. But it was a question of planning it out. And we had some really effective, I thought they were really great workshops in the villages with the communities, and we came up with, what should I say, better planning outcomes than I had expected. The outcomes in terms of an ability to say, yes, here would be fine for the community, we can see the benefits, here we should be avoided. The outcomes of these workshops exceeded my expectations. We took this back to the commission, and it was completely ignored, not by my immediate bosses, but at the 2 levels above, okay, who had no interest in this. They were getting plenty of money for land allocations, and they didn't want to know that this is off limits, this is not good. And in the end, it was better never to have gone to the communities and raised their expectations that things were going to be properly planned. Okay? They had every right to think, but we told you exactly where would have been useful and where wouldn't. And we'd got all that information, and it was totally ignored. Better to have never known it in the first place and not to have raised their expectations about the planning. Okay? But at higher levels, there just wasn't that interest in the participatory input. Okay, so I've said this is a really key issue, is there really demand for the outcomes of this? If there is, and here are examples where that may be, then I think this can add a lot of value. If there's not, then attempts to insert it into the process, maybe there's a long-term agenda, we should be doing it anyway, but there are going to be plenty of frustrations along the way, and I don't really see the easy way to overcome those frustrations purely as technical people. Just going to ask this question as well, thinking back to our diagram which Desiree put up about the policy cycle and the different stages it goes through. And yesterday we talked about how we actually are not bad at planning. We do quite a lot of planning. The problems are at the implementation. And so I just raised the question, what we're doing here is quite often taking a reasonably good policy to a slightly better policy, or a moderate policy to a good policy. But our problem is not actually fundamentally just the quality of the policy, it's the fact we're not implementing the policy that we have. So is this the binding constraint we're tackling? Okay, so let me just finish. Let me say a few more things which are getting a little bit more into some of the politics of this. So as I see it, and I should say where I draw this information from, there's quite a big literature on PRSPs and participation, academic literature, most of which concludes that it didn't really add much value, that the consultations, the inputs of non-state actors really didn't have much impact in shaping what went into those documents. We did a review of CADP processes in 6 or 7 countries, and the same feedback was coming back, that yes, you had to have participation at these key points in the process, but it was often quite token. There was one example from Burkina where the people writing the country reports for us could say, this changed in the CADP documents, this issue is inserted as a result of the participation of non-state actors. Otherwise, very little changed. So what typically came out here was, in the case of CADP, where there were particular events for consultation, non-state actors were invited late, so there was no chance for them to look at a draft of a document and to prepare strong evidence-based input. So they went to the meeting, they said their stuff, which they'd only had about 24 hours to even think about, And then, of course, people said, but they didn't really have evidence to make their case. Okay? And so it was a bit of a vicious circle. They were invited late in the process so that the plan or the policy is almost finalized anyway. So even if they do say something, it's a bit late to make significant changes to it. Or if suggestions are inserted, are those suggestions implemented even if they get in there? And I would just come back to this. We're talking about often, not always, often, inputs at this stage. You may be able to make your input here, but if as non-state actors you have no influence here, here, or here, what you put in there may well have come out again by the time you get to there. Okay? Because you're only being consulted at that point. You have no leverage over this part of the process. There are various impediments to participation, even where governments desire better information. So this slide comes from particularly the Ghana and the Rwanda cases from our CADUP work, which were the places where the government was committed to it. And yet the feedback in the key informant interviews from people on the government side was still, it hadn't lived up to their expectations. They hadn't got as much out of this participation as they wanted. And big issues are, there's mutual suspicion between different actors quite often. Government might suspect the private, might be a bit suspicious of the private sector. Civil society might be suspicious of both, and both might be suspicious of civil society. I talked yesterday about private sector and civil society. If you only have, one or two people represented in a process, to what extent are they representing all of the people who are there? So I talked yesterday in the Tanzanian cotton case, the Jinnahs, there are some who are in favour of this reform, some who are against. It very much depends who's there, what view you're going to get, and how the Farmers Association started as in favour of this reform and then sort of turned 180 degrees part way through due to personal issues with the leadership, and then were hostile after that, even though most farmers, if asked, were positive. Okay, so you can't even be sure if you have one or two people representing that they're really representative of a whole set of views. And this comes to this point that often representative organisations are weak. And this is an area where progress can be made. The politics, other politics don't necessarily get in the way. This is an area where progress can be made to improve things for the future. Finally, this is where we'll bring a bit of politics into it. I say these things are a bit early, that you're in the process, that the sort of political conditions aren't quite right. And one of the fundamental challenges here is that these non-state actors have very little leverage over government. So again, remember what I said yesterday, Nicholas van der Waal talking about African states as quite autonomous, that non-state actors don't have much ability to seriously influence what the government does. Where might leverage be in other contexts? So in US or Europe, the formal private sector makes a major contribution to employment and to national budgets through taxation. They have some bargaining chips. There are programmatic political parties representing a business agenda. So the business people can make their case through those political parties to influence political processes. If they're not happy with what's going on, they have channels through the political system to make their cases. We don't yet observe sort of rural social movements in Africa that we might have seen in some parts of Latin America or Philippines or other places. And we talked yesterday about how rural voters are not really mobilized yet to demand better policies. So if their representatives are in a participatory process, and the government says, well, that's very interesting, but we're not going to take on board your points, they don't have any leverage outside of those processes to make the government actually listen to what they're saying, and it's rather too easy to ignore them. As we're here on a GIZ-sponsored workshop, there was a very influential, at least in UK, influential book called Varieties of Capitalism, which came out about 15 years ago and was comparing how US and UK societies and policy making and things were organised compared to a more corporatist model in Northern Europe, of which Germany was one of the key examples. And I don't know to what extent this is still a reflection of reality, but in the period they were looking at, which was therefore 1990s and earlier, there was a stylized fact that they were looking at was a way that the labour unions and the business organisations and the state made some quite key economic decisions, not least on the influence management of inflation and other things. They made those together in high-level fora. And how did that work? Well, the argument was the labour unions had very strong links to the, what was it, the CSU, was it called? No, S.
It's the Social Democrats.
Say that, Social Democrats, that's right. And the business representatives had very strong links through the CDU. And so if they were not satisfied with what was going on in this policy-making forum, they had their channels through influencing the two main political parties to try and get their voice heard in another way. They had some leverage outside of that particular forum where they were negotiating. So, this final slide actually draws together several ideas. It's drawing on experience from Philippines, Brazil, other places where these social movements have grown up which are influencing policy in particular areas. So poor groups have a lot of awareness raising, and people are mobilized to think, actually, I should be acting and voting on my economic interests. Maybe it's a question of reorienting people's thinking from, I vote for my political patron who helps me out when I need it, to I vote on the basis of my class and social interests. And actually I see that this whole patron-client structure of politics is the problem, not the solution. So there's a lot of popular education around that, and people are mobilized not only to vote differently, but to come out on the street for demonstrations in support of particular policy reforms. But what appears to be the case is it's never just the poor groups. There are normally alliances with sympathetic members of academia who provide intellectual input, lawyers who use sort of legal challenges to different aspects of the process to move the case forward, some MPs who are sympathetic to the interests of the poor. So it is an alliance of mobilized poor groups who have to do a lot of the work themselves with different members of the elite. And putting those groups together, they are able to exert some influence over each stage of the policy process. So you might find that the NGOs and the academics are the ones who contribute to the identifying the problem, but particularly gathering and presenting the evidence and engaging in public debates that this is an issue. Your sympathetic MPs are then the people who present your bills to Parliament. You have various people who are involved in the lobbying of MPs, those who are sympathetic lobby their colleagues. Civil society people are mobilised to lobby other MPs. If it comes to a standoff in Parliament, this is where you need your farmer organisations and other civil society groups out on the street campaigning and saying we want this bill to go through. In other words, you can't just ignore it. civil society and NGOs probably are the people who then are monitoring the implementation to say, is this actually happening or not? And if not, why not? If it's not, it's then on to the lawyers, you know, to why are the things that you said you're doing not happening? And then you have various other people who fund these campaigns. And this is all new stuff. There's some of this in South Africa, but there's not a lot of this in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. Once you start getting somewhere towards this, then the inputs of the people in participatory processes are going to carry far more weight, and it is going to contribute not just to better information in the policy design, but better accountability. For the time being, I guess my view is this is a long-term game that's being played. You might as well start now, and where you have opportunities to create spaces for people to participate, do it. Support it as best you can, but expect it to be fraught with frustrations for the time being, because you're putting it into a context which is not quite ready for it, and it will be a while before you really see the fruits of it, but maybe get started, because it will take a while.